I think this is this okay on the phone, Lee? Does it look all right?
Absolutely fine. We can see you fine. Yeah. So it'd be great. So, I mean, I suppose the key reason you're here, other than it's been my pleasure to have been doing some work with the trust over time, is essentially around your drive around pupil agency, the context that comes out of. But I don't know whether you want to set the scene about you a little first, and about the trust and about Hull.
Yeah, sure. So the political landscape in I was going to say in this part of the world, but I'm in rural North Yorkshire at the minute. I shouldn't forget that. Is the Wild West that is the map landscape was unleashed on Hull fairly early, and ambitious head teachers that really wanted to grasp that opportunity did so. That left us, that we are where we are today, which is, of the city's 80 schools and referral units, we've got 78 of them are now multi-academy trusts, in a multi-academy trust. So there's only 2 not yet there. Of course, what that's meant over time is that, and there are reasons why that's the case, which I'll just hint at in a moment. But the problem that we have at the moment, that we had back in 2015-16, was that when one wanted to go to look for rapid school improvement somewhere or another, the last place you went to at that stage was the local authority, and that was a real problem for us as a maintained school, because, and to a large extent, this is not a lot to do with the local authority and how they've played their game over time. It's just the agenda that's been forced upon Hull over time from other powers that be. When I became a head teacher in 2012, primary school in the east of the city, the data showed that the school was looking at an Ofsted inspection soon, and it was looking at not a good outcome, and that happened shortly after I arrived at the school. We had an inadequate inspection outcome. I looked around to the local, you know what you do, you go to the local secondary school, don't you? Because the secondary schools know everything, don't they? So I went to the local secondary school, and I'd heard that they were thinking about forming a multi-academy trust, and I wanted to know more. And they basically said, go away and come back when you're good, is what they said. Now, I thought the whole point of the program was to actually take on board schools that were struggling and support them to get better, but there we go, that wasn't the case at that point.
It was that difference between sponsorship and conversion, wasn't it? I suppose
yeah,
you're talking about there, and that a lot of sponsors didn't want to sponsor.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were doing their risk analyses, weren't they? So when they did their due diligence type work on you, the first thing they went to was the Ofsted inspection report, most recent one. Ours was very recent, and so the answer was, it was a polite answer, sort of, we want to set up our trust in a way that puts it on the best possible footing, and that probably means not taking too much risk on at this time, those sorts of words, So we were out in the cold, really, and not really knowing where to go. We had with other schools in the city, 10 schools in the city, become Cooperative Foundation Trust schools. That was back in 2013. And to be perfectly honest, this was a sort of this was to protect ourselves against forced academisation at that moment in time. I'll be perfectly open about that. 2015, one of those schools, a large secondary school in Hull, Kelvin Hall, got its outstanding outcome, and that sort of opened a door. It opened a sort of it opened a mental door in all of us to sort of say, maybe we could do this together. Maybe we could do this without necessarily going to one of the big chains or somewhere else.
So as Cooperative Foundation Trust at the time, you were all working to some extent, cooperating with each other, were you?
We were cooperating with each other, but I wish I'd been in on earlier in the previous conversation around governance. Our model was more about participation and representation than it was about school improvement, and it was about expert knowledge within the system and gaining the best of all of that. So we were working together, but to little avail, really.
Right.
So this is, I think some of this is because people are protective of their own settings. So when I was approached by the local authority actually. Once we, and Ings Primary School we got our good result 18 months after the inadequate one. We then went to, I was asked then to give some support to another school within the cooperative family, and support just wasn't wanted. So, you know, participation and involvement was wanted, but not the sort of support where it might be the sort of the nuts and bolts of, we need to talk about the significant problem the school has got and what we do to take it forward type support. So that's how we came to be a trust, really. We started out with just 5 schools in 2016, and we're now 9 schools, and we're working in partnership with another secondary school on this so-called try before you buy deal. At the moment, I need to fill you in on that, Lee, at some point. That's taken a few steps further forward with the DFE in the last couple of weeks. Right. And another meeting on Thursday about that. So that's how we got to. We're now equal numbers in terms of pupils, 50-50 primary, secondary, which I think is I really enjoy that part, that statistic. I like that metric because there's an equality of so-called power within the system. You know, there's that thing we can do there. And we've got 2 secondary schools and 7 primaries all in Hull. And we started out with, you know, in Ofsted terms, and that's this is probably the 18th time I've mentioned Ofsted in 5 minutes, but so apologies for that. But we started out with 3 requires improvement schools within that group, and we're now down to 1. So we are, you know, we've all got good or outstanding. So that's a better position to be in, and I think we've worked hard on school improvement and our model for that. And that's the work that you've done with us, Lee, isn't it? Is helping us to reflect and think and moderate that as we go along. I need to fill you in on that as well. That's been some good work there. The reason Hull went so quickly and so rapidly down the academisation route was just a gross lack of any political leadership on the issue locally. I would invite elected members, and I would invite council officers to come and talk to my governing body about options for school designation around academisation, and the response from all those people was, we'll support you to do whatever you want to do. You want to become an academy? That's fine. If you don't, that's fine. If you want to stay and maintain school, that's fine. Meanwhile, 3 miles away in the East Riding of Yorkshire, Tory-controlled East Riding of Yorkshire, always has been, always will be. There's implacable opposition to the academisation agenda. Full stop. End of. The schools will maintain schools, and we will provide from the centre a strong school improvement function. And if the government wants to cut that by 50%, as they're currently doing, we'll find that from some other budgets somehow. We'll make it happen. I believe that's their position at this moment in time. So that's the sort of the bigger picture of where we're at, where we've come from and where we're up to at the moment. Hull is an area of high disadvantage, so we'll have schools within our trust. All Hull schools are disadvantaged, but sometimes we get around the table and we play sort of, you know, disadvantaged trumps or whatever it's called. You know, we the top trumps type game of I can raise you another 5% on my EAL cohort. Oh, I can, you know, that sort of game that gets played. But we've got schools where more than 99% of the school population will be in the top 5% for deprivation nationally. All the way through to the heady heights of only 60% of the population are in that group. So we are in an area of high disadvantage. However, because our key stage 2 results in 2018 and 2019 were good across the city, we don't qualify for any levelling up funding whatsoever at this moment in time, which is a fascinating position to be in, one of the most deprived places on the receipt of, at this moment in time, in education terms, diddly squat. So that's an interesting dynamic on that one at the moment, and there's quite a lot of outrage there at the minute, because, and I do think the most worrying thing for me is Will Hutton's piece in the Observer on Sunday. I don't know if you got to that bit where he was saying we really should all be reading this levelling up white paper. The analysis he was rating as outstanding. He was just worrying over Rishi Sunak's contribution and whether it will actually happen, because if the Treasury don't get foursquare behind it, it's really worth looking at that from a.
I guess there's a potential political edge to what you're saying here, given that Hull has always been red wall and is never likely to be anything other than red wall, right? So, and that kind of debate around leveling up being managed as a political tool as much as an economic one.
And in terms of 2016 EU referendum, Hull on paper voted to leave. Mm-hmm. You know, and in terms of the last general election, Labour majorities were cut drastically. So I would think if there's an agenda behind levelling up, you would think they'd want to target it at Hull to some extent, but not at the minute. It doesn't seem that way. So that's our rough background at the moment. Should we talk pupil agency?
Yeah, let's go for it.
Let's talk about that. So I've got 3 books. I said I brought props. I haven't brought props. I've got 3 books with me. Okay. Three books that are informing our thinking on this at the moment. One of which has such a good title, we changed the name of the trust to fit in with it. Is this one here? So this is Hannon and Peterson's book that was, I think, published about a year ago now. Thrive in terms of this diagram here. What I'll do, Lee, after this, I will get good copies of these.
I think I might have a slide of that diagram myself. I probably, right. While you're talking, if I can, I'll have a hunt for it.
Yeah. So what Amelia Peterson and Valerie Hannon do in this book, and they're both, I believe, sort of part-time employees of OECD and inform that whole national global agenda. They are coming at this from the 4 main areas of challenge to our young people now, and they start in the right place as far as I'm concerned, which is the planetary and the global dynamic, the climate crisis and the effect that this is having now on the mental well-being of our pupils. And well, we could talk flooding right now. Maybe we're talking now about the effects of the climate crisis, most certainly being felt in our generation, but will most certainly be felt head on by the generation currently in school. In fact, and I love this metric, if you are in a nursery school today, so if you're 4 years old today in a nursery, by the time you leave the state system aged 18, that's the point at which we've signed up to meet all sorts of carbon reduction strategy stuff. This stuff is happening, and it's now, and it's real, and that's that first dimension is really important. I'll come back to that in a moment. The second dimension, the 2 authors call it the societal. We refer to it as the community level stuff. And the 2 big challenges there that we must do something about are the rise of populism via a low-informed democracy, the inability for a lot of us to be able to tell truth from fiction, to be able to discern what's right and wrong when we look at stuff on the internet, the arrival of the movement from bubble think through to echo chamber think, all those sorts of ideas, and what we can do in schools to combat that. And the second communal aspect is the changing nature of the labour market, which sort of I'll leads me to the second book, Matthew Syed's book. There you go. That's the one there. Where's that resource from, Lee? Is that
good question?
There you go.
Gelp Online.
Gelp Online. Thank you. Thanks for that. The second book is Matthew Syed's 2019 book, which is called, can you see that? I can't see if are you presenting at the minute, Leo?
I've stopped sharing for now. So,
which is the book Rebel Ideas, which is really a book about teams and about how cognitively diverse teams are the best sorts of teams when dealing with knotty, difficult, complex problems. Whereas your one hero, head teacher, savior figure, Superman, Superwoman figure is probably great in a moment of crisis where a snap decision needs taking because we need to do something very promptly. But when looking at things like how are we going to improve this school over the next 5 years, that is not just a one-person conversation. And we need cognitive teams for doing that. I'm referencing back to Hannon and Peterson's community here. This is just a couple of sentences from Matthew Syed. Labour experts predict that the children of today will have as many as a dozen jobs, the majority of which have yet to be invented. So it's just that sort of the pace of change thing that we're coping with at the moment. And we pretend in this country that our curricula are best positioning our young people for that future jobs market, whereas the future jobs market is changing so rapidly that we can't predict what that's going to be like. In fact, according to Matthew Syed, those jobs haven't even been dreamt up yet. We don't know what we're talking.
Jonathan, as long as they know more and can remember more, they're all set for it.
So our thinking on that, Lee, is that and this is how we're trying to reframe that knowledge-based curriculum idea, is that yes, we need to produce really great learners, but before that, we need to produce really great thinkers. Mm-hmm. There's a subtle difference there. It's almost a semantic difference, really, but there's a subtle difference there. We need to produce flexible brains that are going to be able to adapt to a rapidly changing world, no matter what that looks like. The fourth level, Hannon and Peterson's level in Thrive, is the intrapersonal, and this is of course largely features the impact of social media on children, young people, on us. Let's be honest. You know, the impact of that, especially in the way in which they are navigating sex and relationships, and how they're forming relationships. And we're seeing this at the moment through the whole everyone's invited agenda, the sexual harassment, sexual violence agenda that's been so-called dealt with nationally. That's the agenda that Ofsted suddenly recognised about this time last year, that agenda, after it had been outed via the Everyone's Invited website massively in lots of schools, mostly private schools in the south of England, including your big hitters, your Etons, your Winchesters and Marlboroughs, were suddenly having all sorts of testimony posted online about the behaviour of their students, mostly their boys, who have gained their whole sex education from Pornhub. So there's all of that agenda. And the last agenda is for young persons. We've got the global, the community level, the intrapersonal level, the relationships level. Then there's that interpersonal level. How on earth do you cope with all of that as a young person? How do I manage my own well-being? How do I have a secure sense of identity and hope? And how do I do all of that? You know, when every time I switch on the news, it seems as if I've just been sat in a coffee shop in Ripon. I managed to. It's back to the whole problem with moving into a new space. I got here last night, put a pizza in the oven, and the fan oven managed to incinerate the pizza, set off all the smoke alarms and what have you. So I ate my croissant for breakfast last night for tea. Ripon this morning, and in Ripon this morning, two young people on their phones, and their level of thinking was this: have you noticed that today is the 22nd day of the second month? Have you had this text yet? It's doing the rounds on Twitter right now. It's the 22nd day of the second month of the 22nd year. If you add it all up and take away, you end up with 666. And then, of course, you just got to look at what's happening today in the east of the Ukraine this morning, with tanks rolling over the border. And they were putting all of that together, mashing it all up together, and coming out with a whole lot of worry for themselves about the end of the world. That was this morning in Ripon, in in Cafe Nero. There you go. That's what we're dealing with here. It's that level of lack of analytical thought, lack of critical thought around these big issues that just leads to these knee-jerk reactions via the wonders that is social media. So mixing up that.
And when you were talking about that, I was thinking back to what you were saying about intrapersonal. Everyone's invited, boys' behaviour, as well as broadly that kind of anxiety culture I suppose we're living in to some extent, right? The kind of the pandemic world that has particularly, I think, affected primary children's understanding of the world, especially if they've had direct impact of it, but more broadly, all of us. You know, every time you take a lateral flow test, there's a degree of anxiety around that process.
Yeah, anxiety is at every turn. Yeah, for sure. And how we assist our young people to navigate through all of that is a fairly complex question. And if I just sort of map out very briefly how the approaches we're taking to try and give our pupils some way of navigating their way through this thing called life in the 2020s. So what and it sort of plays back a bit to what was said earlier on in the conversation around governance, around the involvement of young people. You know, one of the things we haven't cracked yet forum-wise is representation of young people in all of that. I think there's a whole load of work here for us to do around making sure that young people, whilst we always, you know, quotes from the national curriculum, want to learn we want to learn from the best of human thought over historical periods and all that. Of course we do. That there is a missing voice in all of this, which is the voice of the young person. And I'm just reflecting back here on the sexual health, sexual harassment, sexual violence agenda. The moment we started to listen to young people around that agenda, which was about Easter last year, I mean, seriously listen, and put together, we've put together what I would like to think is a really good model for how you go about that listening project all the way through from nursery to year 11. And we did that. We listened to young people, obviously, in an age-appropriate way around those issues and gave them a voice. And then we set up something we should have set up years ago, which is, you know, that you said, we did, this is the response from the feedback you gave us, these are the improvements that we're making together. What do you think? What do you think now? Are things getting better? Are things improving? Does the online reporting tool that we've put in place for out of hours reporting of sexual harassment or the requests for nudes and all that sort of stuff, is it working? Is it having an effect? The fact you told us that there were these dead spots in school called the stairways in this wonderful £18 million lovely brand spanking new shiny secondary school. The fact that there were these dead spots that the girls you were worried about, the fact that we've put more staff in there over at key points, is that having an effect? All those sorts of things. The fact you told us the locker system in the changing rooms was no good. The fact that you told us that wearing shorts was leading to, and so on, and is that helping? Is that having the desired effect from a pupil perspective? And just including them intrinsically in those feedback loops. So that's just can we making the best use of feedback. Lee, do you want to say? Did I hear a hand?
I was just thinking about this. This is a sort of profound both agency and equity point that you're addressing here, isn't it? Because you're talking about something that, you know, speaking as a man, my experience is limited, but probably most of the women in this room can speak to that language and harassment of men at some period in their lives. And it's almost like this unspoken thing that has existed in schools for such a long time. And then you're looking at Rebel Ideas again, because it's not talked about. And the fact that you've opened it up, and it's such an obviously huge yet long-term silent inclusion, diversity and equity point is profound for those young people.
Yeah, it is. I love a diagram. So Hannon's 4-stage diagram there, from the global to the interpersonal, through to that top diagram there, which is which is that Syed's position of having the perfect team here. We've got cognitive dissonance in terms of we've got various people all thinking different things, but bounded within the same, which is basically the same mission statement. We're all on the same page there. There are no rebels outside of it, and we're all feeding through to someone who can actually make some sort of some difference and some real actionable change. That idea of having different cognitive styles, and I wouldn't, obviously that can't just be limited to gender differences or differences, any cultural difference whatsoever. But we need a and it's a particularly difficult thing to pull off in Hull, I have to say. But we need as much difference as we can to solve these difficult problems. What our key way of right across the trust at the moment of gaining more involvement from our young people, of giving them not just the impression that they're at the heart of their schools, but that they are at the heart of their schools. We've all signed up to. We've all signed up and started to take action on our carbon footprint and our carbon reduction strategy for 2030, hoping to be net carbon zero, net neutral by 2030. So we've got the Eco Schools programme running now in all 9 schools. Now, at one level, and we've made sure that has to be a part of the school council, or we've still got one school that calls it the Senate, but there we go. They call it what they like, but it's at the centre of what that school council is doing, and that there are feedback loops to the rest of the school community. So it's not just, as can often happen with these sorts of things, can happen. We find 5 bright and sparky young people who really want to go with this, and we find those young people don't always have the ear of the rest. So it's solving that problem in the first instance. We've employed someone, as you know, Lee, to lead on this and coordinate that work across the trust. We've given someone the title pupil engagement, which for us is pupil agency within their job title, and that's their responsibility. So the Eco Schools programme in Hull as well, we've got a fantastic historic link with Sierra Leone in West Africa and Freetown, Sierra Leone. We've got all sorts of twinning projects with them, and if the government will change its mind on reducing the funding of that, it's all overseas aid budget money, I'm afraid, that would help, because we've got this great exchange program of teachers getting to Freetown, Sierra Leone, and Freetown, Sierra Leone coming to Hull every 4 years. And that work in a place like Hull, where in terms of our ethnic mix in Hull, we are not at all like London and many parts of the world. We're predominantly white working class, although Polish, Lithuanian, Romanian immigration recently has changed that dynamic significantly. But having that global awareness through Eco Schools, i.e. the planet and the climate crisis, and doing something about that at a local level, and that being led by young people and monitored by young people and reported on by young people to young people, and also via this link we call the International Pupil Council, which is that link with Sierra Leone, just broadening horizons about the rest of the world. Those are our 2 key bits this year, to get embedded in each school, or to get started in each school, and to go through the embedding process next year and the year after. And just on that, it reminds me, the 3rd book is Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, which is only worth buying for one diagram, I think. And it's not a very good diagram, but it's this one here. If you look her up on TED Talks and just see the 15-minute TED Talk that Kate Raworth did, this is about 6-7 years ago now, on donut economics. That idea in that diagram, that there is what she calls here the social foundation below which we're not going to allow anyone to fall. But the problem with our current economic model in the West is that GDP rules. And as long as GDP grows and we've got growth forever, A, we get elected, B, our citizens are happy with us. What she's saying is the climate crisis has got to limit that assumption that we can have endless growth. It's fraught with difficulties anyway. So she puts that lower ceiling lower platform rather, below which no one shall fall, and the upper ceiling above which we cannot go because we will just destroy the planet in the meantime. I think there's some good thinking in there for schools, for young people and schools around all of that, what it truly means to live sustainably.
There's a neat connection there for me with that book, with I think it was 2010, The Spirit Level, why equality is better for everyone. Kate Pickett, I think that was.
Yeah,
a whole
Pickett,
series of brilliant analyses.
Yeah, it was Wilkinson and Pickett, wasn't it? Or Pickett and Wilkinson. And what they did in that book was they said that they looked at everything in the world that we get frustrated about, from rates of drug use, teenage pregnancy, etc., low rates of literacy, and all that sort of stuff. And after graph after graph after graph in the Spirit Level book, they aim to show that the more unequal your society is, the gap between the richest and the poorest is, then the more of these problems you'll have. And if we can do something about that, then we would be, if we could do something about the massive gap between rich and poor we've got chronically in this country at the moment, the more we will have a more equal society and a less problematic society as a result. Yeah. So that's where we're up to with all of that. There's a lot of theory in there. There's a lot of diagrammatic stuff, but I do like a diagram. I think people find them a visual on these things helpful, because they sometimes we have some people amongst us who's if we allowed still to talk about learning styles, which EAF are telling us we're not allowed to talk about learning styles anymore, but if we were, some people need a diagram, they need a visual to be able to grasp it, and I'm one of those people.
Jonathan, thank you. I mean, lots of stuff to think about in terms of what you're doing around pupil agency. So I'll start us off in terms of the biggest impact so far. Would you say that's around those two areas you've highlighted, the climate crisis and everyone's invited?
And what fascinated me in all this, Lee, so just briefly on that, is that when I got into lessons during lockdown this time last year, and I was dropping into live learning and just seeing how that was going. Now, I was a recently appointed CEO of our trust, and I'd come from primary school, so I was interested to see how that was looking in secondary school. And I dropped into a year 9. Secondary colleagues will be familiar with this scenario, I think. I dropped into a year 9 geography lesson. It was about the economic impact of tourism in Jamaica, and what the pupils were expected to give back. You see, was the response that was being required was the response that they might face on the exam paper, which is going to get them 3 points, 3 marks. And so it was all via Google Classroom. So on the Jamboard, various pupils had put up various things about the impact of tourism in Jamaica, and there was some of the required answers were there, and some of the not required answers were there. One girl had put the impact of all that CO2, all those planes flying around the world, and the climate crisis. And the teacher in that moment, and people will maybe go, "Oh God, what a missed opportunity," and so did I, said, "I really like that answer, but it's not on the syllabus. It's not going to get you any marks in this element about tourism in Jamaica. So if we just disregard that for now, is that okay? Good, moving on." And this whole and there was an evident disappointment in that session from the pupils about that. I completely understand where the teacher's coming from and the pressure to get those pupils to jump through that hoop. But where do the pupils get the opportunity to be able to say, we're worried about this stuff, we're concerned about this stuff? Now, Alok Sharma at COP26 promised that the issues of sustainability would be placed at the heart of the curriculum. Now, has anyone heard anything more than that, apart from a very flimsy DFE document that came out the week after, which someone was probably writing over the weekend to be perfectly honest. There's no strategy behind that at the moment. It's up to us to find ways of doing this and not disappoint pupils with responses like they got in that geography lesson. Sorry, I've not answered your question, have I?
Well, I think what you're saying is something about a couple of things, really, a couple of complex things. One is about agency in classrooms and whether the curriculum model we have in place, particularly where it's outcomes focused, drives a limited set of engagement parameters for children. Alongside, anecdotally, I know that a lot of DFE decisions are made almost on the hoof. I think as far as I'm aware, Gove's EBAC model was Sam Friedman being asked to do something about, standards and the equivalence with Singapore over the weekend.
Yeah,
we know that what we accept as this is the reality for all of us in schools is driven by a very quick bit of thinking often that isn't thought through. But your broader point is about, are classrooms limiting the agency and engagement of young people based on the model we currently have, and what can we do about that? Is that fair?
That's it, yeah. So in terms of looking at how teachers can have the confidence to go, as Tom Sherrington would put it, off-piste, how do we do that? How do we go? How do we do that? I've got plenty of teachers who love to go off-piste. They really do. And I'm wanting them back on the tracks a bit more sometimes, because there's a certain end point in time that comes that we've got to get people ready for. But how do we go? I'm not saying we've got the answers to this yet at all. It's something we're wrestling with at the moment. That's why I read Rebel Ideas, because the whole point here, I think, is that we're not saying we necessarily need to rebel against the curriculum model that's given to us, but we need to have creative, thoughtful ways of approaching that, which does allow teachers to go off-piste and to go off QCA message for a few minutes, so we can actually engage in what that young person is saying right now. Now, maybe we're an extreme case, and I'd be glad to hear we are in terms of what I saw in that. It wasn't just one lesson like that, it was a number of lessons. Maybe we're an outlier on this because maybe we're an outlier because, to be perfectly frank, a lot of our learners get to that grade 4, grade 5 type position right at the death. Mm-hmm. We're going right to the wire here, everybody. And you know what? It looks like it's going to be a right to the wire type situation for a lot of years, probably maybe forever, because we start from such a low start point in our city. It's the same with phonics testing in year 1. It's the same at end of key stage 2. It's the same at end of key stage 4. We get there, and we get there well, but my God, we just drop over the line. And do you know what? Some of our pupils probably die of exhaustion just after they pass the finish tape. Mm-hmm. That's a worrying thing as well.
So it seems like there's, one of the issues here is that kind of breadth. But when you're talking, I'm thinking back to my time as an English teacher, when Of Mice and Men was regularly taught, and I'm coming back, I guess, to sexual violence and everyone's invited. And one of the reasons I stopped teaching Of Mice and Men, other than the fact that I liked to teach a range of texts rather than the same one every blooming time, was what I call the Curly's wife response. Curly's wife, if you don't know Of Mice and Men, never has a name. She is simply the wife of a violent man. She is clearly sexually and physically abused by this man, and she ends up being murdered. And there is very little sympathy often that comes from pupils in the classroom at the death of this woman. And that has always, for me, opened up a huge set of questions around, number one, the portrayal of women, but number two, when you're a victim and when you're not a victim, and how that is perceived by young people in their communities. So there's a whole set of things here around curriculum, I suppose, we're exploring. On the one hand, there's that opportunity to think and go off-piste. On the other hand, there's that extent to which we challenge or readdress whole sets of thinking and assumptions that our young people often have about 50% of their community.
Yeah.
Sarah, have you got any thoughts on this as a secondary specialist? And then I'll broaden it to all the other teachers.
No, only that I agree. But I mean, my subject, science, originally, I mean, I haven't been active in the classroom for a few years, but it's the same matter that Jonathan raises, is that there were things you just didn't teach because you only had a limited amount of time to actually and you were judged, and schools were judged on that piece of work. But this is also part of being involved in the cooperative movement, is it does give young people a voice outside of what their curriculum might be limited by in secondary schools, into a much broader forum. And you know that what the work you've done there is, you know, just what I enjoy seeing young people do, but formalize sometimes the young cooperative movement, which is part of our journey, as to actively engage young cooperatives together, because they tend to be activist groups, and cooperation should be an activist movement, not a passive one, where leadership is shown. So I think the curriculum, I don't know how to resolve that one, but certainly young cooperatives are maybe the answer around being able to be more activist in our communities.
Yeah, and with the proviso, I guess, that you've already made, Jonathan, around who gets to democratically participate in activism, because you already said sometimes it's the student council types who are non-representative of their communities, right?
Yeah, and but even there, I think sometimes when Greta Thunberg started her Friday school strikes for the climate, was it 3 years ago now, or 4 maybe? Anyway, I wasn't CEO at that time, but I did speak to secondary leads and just said, you know, how are we thinking about this? Is this going to cause us a great problem? Am I going to have to cross a picket line when I get to school on Friday? You know, well, let me tell you, the answer was just a resounding no, don't worry. No worry, you won't need to worry about that. And that for me is a real concern, that, and we've needed to find out, is that because young people just feel, oh, what's the point? You know, is that where they're coming from? Because really, we do want children and young people being worried about that. We do want Greta Thunberg springing up from amongst our ranks, and we do want them to give us the headache of dealing with how their attendance figures on a Friday might look. You know, I think that's something we should be encouraging. So we are agitating, to use the word, I suppose, in that sense, through doing what we're doing, but doing it in a way that keeps kids actively engaged in school, rather than something they need to fight against us in school about, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, sort of constructive disagreement, that expectation in classrooms that you're expecting kids to disagree with what's being said in a way that stimulates thinking and learning. Yeah,
the chapter in Syed's book is called Constructive Dissent, and it's the best chapter in the book. If you just read the one chapter or get it on, get it as a book to listen to. The constructive dissent idea is really, really good and powerfully portrayed, I think, in that book. We do want some dissent and challenge in classrooms, and you're right, passivity is something, especially coming back after COVID, that we saw. And I don't know, our feeling is that, especially amongst boys as well, a lot more sit there passivity, which is a real problem. But yeah, there we are.
You've raised your hand.
Did I?
No, sorry, John O'Connor, not Jonathan.
So there's two Johns, always good.
Hey, John.
Jonathan, thanks for your thoughts, and a whole range of, actually it's provocative. There's my shorthand for what's been raised. I think there's actually a really massive issue for cooperative education in this. I mean, as I get older, I'm probably becoming more activist and more concerned by the issues you've raised, Black Lives Matter, climate change, the rest of it. And I stood outside a small town hall last weekend with a group protesting about the cost of living crisis. Several people went by, politely took a leaflet, then folded it and put in the shopping. And a number of people just said, what's the point? makes no difference. And we have got a massive issue with citizenship, apathy, all those things. And some in the group might have a different political view, but I think you get the government you deserve, you know, through your engagement in civic life and society. Now, I'm heading towards a view that the directive issued by the DfE on neutral, non-biased education is actually incredibly biased. I think it mitigates towards apathy, passive, and persuadable young people who have not been exposed to the right to dissent or the debate or the discussion of difficult issues. The education profession has been amazing, in my experience, at being judicious in providing balance and so on. So I actually think this directive is in opposition to cooperative values. I do not see how you can engender self-help, self-responsibility, you know, respect, all those things. And I would simply suggest fairly strongly, I believe there's a formal response needed on behalf of co-op schools. I think this is an official DfE position on education that is wrong. It's unclear, it's fuzzy, but the thrust is a disincentive to the core elements of, dare I use that phrase, you know, real, somewhere under the massive hype, real British values, real sense of global responsibility, all those things. I genuinely feel we should be actually looking at doing a bit of a dissection or analysis and putting forward a response to the Department for Education. Watch that space.
I don't think you're an isolated voice. I certainly know that Dan Morrow from Dartmoor Met, Sarah's CEO, has been very active on Twitter at arguing against this, and kind of the threat that you come across as a woke social justice warrior shouldn't be something that worries you.
Yeah, exactly that. And just on, we do need that analysis though. The thing only came out, was it last Tuesday? In the meantime, we've also had, and I do urge colleagues to look through the white paper on levelling up. It is very incisive in its analysis, and yet if Sunak can get behind it with some cash, it could be of significance. You know, what they've done is, obviously the slogan has been brought into some sort of policy framework now via the brain that is Michael Gove, and that's a not unformidable brain at times. And it's worth looking at. And just in terms of the cost of living crisis, for example, you know, we've got all our schools are committed every Thursday to running food banks out of the schools, and we do that. And we do work now that's sort of been nationally recognised in that sense. But we do know that people struggle, and I've had an email exchange over the last 48 hours. Our gas bills as a trust are going up by 127%. You know, they're going up to approaching the £500,000 a year mark for gas and electricity across our trust. Factor that down to every family in our schools as well. It's just incredible pressure that's on people at the moment. So, sorry, I've waffled around that thing. So let's just bring that back to, do we have the right to dissent? I'm not. I need to read it fully. I need to read what came from the department in absolute detail last week. I think it didn't seem on first glance through the press on it, that it was that radical or that there was an attempt to shut us up in that sense. There's a reason though why successive governments over many decades have not gone near this issue. And I do wonder why they've decided to go near this issue at this moment in time.
I suppose, speaking personally, it's very easy to see this as something that was thrown as meat for the right-wing tabloid press, but the right-wing tabloid press had its own version of meat in the 80s around homosexuality and AIDS, and Section 28 emerged from that red meat. so legislation can come into existence based on meat being thrown to audiences. So that's my warning proviso that sits against some aspects of this. That's a very personal one, I suppose. Yeah, but it's important for us to hear that, because there are others, obviously, who just who sometimes attempt to think that could never happen here. That could never happen here. But any final thoughts or questions for Jonathan? Lee, I'll just say, just before we finish, we've actually hooked up on this whole idea of agency. We're getting some academic backup from Hull University on this now, which is going to, I think, really helpful. So by this time next year, we should be through methodologies of research that I'm not familiar with, to do with participatory research groups and all sorts of things. Going to have something maybe to report back on how well this is going with our young people and what our young people are saying to us in the round about it. Right. So that would be. I've got two hands up. I'll go to Katie first.
Yes, I just wanted to add to what you said, Lee, in terms of the red meat, because the other area is ethnicity, and particularly Islamophobia. And I would recommend that there's a podcast appeared last week around the whole Trojan horse issue in Nottingham, in Birmingham. It's an investigative thing, and out of the Trojan horse thing, which appears now, everybody has agreed it was a fraud, but out of it came legislation that prevent policy approach, all kinds of restrictions. So the press were thrown the red meat off the Trojan horse. It was an opportunity. It wasn't necessarily started at a government level, but it fed in to an agenda that they wanted to promote. So I would recommend that. You have to be quite committed to listen to the podcast, because it goes on for 8 hours.
Okay, sure.
There are eight or 9 episodes of it, but it is engrossing, and it's easily available. So I think I do.
But I guess it's the point that myth making can lead to legislation.
Indeed,
and so this notion that there is this woke tranche of teachers indoctrinating young people into a certain way of thinking, that certain parts of the press and social media like to believe, can drive an engine led by Oliver Dowden et al. Into legislation.
Indeed, and with the Trojan horse, that is exactly what has happened. There were changes made to the curriculum, the prevent agenda, big changes really as a result of a fraudulent document. I mean, it's the same with anti-Semitism, isn't it? That there have been historically exactly the same pattern followed. So we do need to be alert to that, don't we?
Yeah, thanks, Katie. And John O'Connor.
I mean, firstly, just to agree with Katie, I think that it might appear that this isn't over significant, but it's where it leads. And I think that's what we need to be alert to. I was just going to throw in a very basic practicality. About 4 or 5 years back, we had some actually positive contact with AF Infinity, which is it's an East of England cooperative that do major procurement for energy supplies. And we were in a conversation that might be worth renewing. I almost got a pun there about energy supplies, no, renewable. Just to explore whether we can actually support our members with some of those cost pressures by rebrokering some potential scaled contracting. So it's just a thought, and I can pick up with Lee where those conversations were. But just think about the reality. If you're going to see massive lumps of money withdrawn from school resourcing because of the energy cost, actually we ought to be looking at what we can do about it. Okay.
And we should. There's what's called supplementary funding to cover any major uplift on this as well. So So the department is giving us some, is alleviating the pain of it to some extent, but not entirely.
Jonathan, thank you so much for your contribution and making us think so broadly about pupil agency, both in the context of being a cooperative, democratic participation, reaching all areas of your community, but also in terms of their future lives, and that some key issues around everyone's invited and the climate crisis and what that means for them, as well as the job market. Thanks very much.
Yeah.